We don't write your face, put a cup in front. Hello, everybody. My name's Adrian Bell, and I'm here today with Crystal Long, another Access MVP, and we're going to talk about the CurrentDb method, which, as many of you will probably already know, returns a DAO.database object. The way we'll do this today is Crystal will ask me some questions, and I will do the best I can to give meaningful answers. So, Crystal, the first question, if you would, please. What's the difference between CurrentDb versus DBEngine 0.0? Well, for that, I'm going to take you, first of all, to the link on Microsoft Docs website, which talks about CurrentDB, and they have a panel, which I will read out because it answers that very well and gives a bit more information too. In previous versions of Microsoft Access, you may have used the syntax DBEngine dot workspaces 0 dot databases 0 or DBEngine 0.0 to return a pointer to the current database. In Microsoft Access 2000 and later, you should use the CurrentDb method instead. The CurrentDb method creates another instance of the current database, while the DBEngine 0.0 syntax refers to the open copy of the current database. The CurrentDb method enables you to create more than one variable of type database that refers to the current database. Microsoft Access still supports the DBEngine 0.0 syntax, but you should consider making this modification to your code in order to avoid possible conflicts in a multi-user database. I'll translate that last bit into, yeah, don't really use that anymore. It doesn't do the job as well as you would like, and it leaves you a little bit exposed to complicated problems. Okay, so the follow-on to that first question, Crystal, if you would. What are the parameters in parentheses? Well, they, as you can see from the same panel on the web page, the first 0 refers to workspaces 0, and that's the default within DBEngine. And the second 0 refers to databases, which is the default within a workspace. So that's the answer to that one. So the next question, please, Crystal. Why use a database object variable instead of repeating CurrentDb when you want to reference it? Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me take you through a little bit of what CurrentDb does so that you can see why it's a better approach to do it once and then continuing from there to reuse that or other variables created from that. CurrentDb is a method. It's a method. What it does is it returns, it's a function method, so it returns a value, and the value it returns is a DAO.database object, which is fine. Why that's different from the DBEngine 0.0 is that it returns a pointer, or it returns an object which it has created. It is created, and the collections within it have been created from scratch to reflect the current situation of the current database. Okay, so the next question is, Crystal, what can happen if you use CurrentDb instead of an object variable? Well, I think we've half covered that. What can happen if you continue to use CurrentDB and you repeat it is that it's not too drastic. It recreates new database variables, but they're different database variables. they're not the same. It does work that's essentially, I would say, entirely unnecessary, which isn't the worst thing, but then you have the situation where one CurrentDB is not the same as another. It points to the same database, but there are other things within a database variable which are not, which vary over time. So another returned value of CurrentDB will definitely not be equal to the first one. And it may, within that database, even though the current database in your actual database hasn't changed, the two different variables could have different settings within them. Okay, I hope that's answered that question. So on to the next one, Crystal. Why do you not close the database object returned from CurrentDB? That's another great one, because this is another one that people often get confused over. Now, generally speaking, when you set up a variable, you create an object of some sort, you set it to a variable, you run along with it, do whatever you need to do, and then when you're finished, you close it and you release the variable. So that would be setting the variable to nothing. However, with CurrentDB, you're not opening anything. You don't actually go along. You don't go along and say, right, open this database. That is not done. So you shouldn't be closing it. It's already open. It's open in the user's interface. So what you see in Access, it's open, it's there. So if you were to close it, logically, you wouldn't just be closing what you're working with in your code, you'd be closing the whole database. And that's clearly, well, in 99% of cases, that's not what you want to do. And that is why you never close the database object returned from CurrentDB. Okay, next question, please, Crystal. How do you release the memory allocated? Well, I've almost covered that already. When you have an object variable and memory is allocated for that within CurrentDB, it creates a bunch of memory for your use. When you've finished, you set that database variable to nothing. Set variable name equals nothing, which is what you would hopefully do with almost all of your object variables that you create when you want to work with them. When you finish with them, you close them. And the next part of that question, Crystal, please. What if you don't? Well, that's a very good follow-on. If you don't, then there are two things that can happen, essentially, depending on the scope of the variable. If your variable is global in scope, then that memory will stay allocated, stay in use, unfreed up, and until your project closes. So until you close that database, your current database, if you like, from the interface or however you do it, that will stay locked up and wasting space. However, if your database variable is in a module with scope, so for instance, it's a form module, or it's in a procedure, so in a procedure, whether it's in a standard global or form object module, if it's in any of those, then the Access or VBA's automatic what I sometimes call a dust cart. It's when it clears away after you, as it does, it will set all of the objects that you've got defined within that scope to nothing. So that's, generally speaking, if it's scoped in that way, you don't have to worry about it, but a lot of people feel that that's good policy to release it anyway when you're finished with it. Okay, so the last question we have here is, Crystal, when would you use OpenDatabase? Thank you. That's a whole nother can of worms, if I may say it that way. In Access, it helps to know in Access you have a database that's open, and that's the database that you're using with the interface. And that's referred to as the current database. So it's current database for the user, and it's also current database in your code. Okay, you may use CurrentDB to set an object variable to it, but it's referring to the current database. But it's also possible with linked tables and various other things to have other databases open in your code and in your project. There is an OpenDatabase procedure, which is a method. Obviously, it's a function. It returns another DAO.database. This is different in many respects, and you can have as many of these as your system can cope with. Essentially, 64-bit systems typically allow a good deal more than 32-bit systems, but it's essentially limited only by the amount of resources you have in your computer. And the main difference here is this is not a current database. This is a database. It's an object that you open, and therefore you're expected to close when you're finished. Also, once you've closed it, you would typically and hopefully release the memory allocated by saying set your database variable to nothing. So this is quite different from your current database. You may have a database that you want to leave open all the time, and that's perfectly fine. If you open a database in your code and leave it open, it can mean that your linked tables, when they come to link, if they don't already have, if they need security that says who they are, if you've already opened it, they won't need to go through that phase. So it can simplify things in some respects. But generally speaking, a database is opened and closed in the normal way. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And thank you very much for your questions, Crystal. I'll leave that for today and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Say again? You can't, no, obviously you can't. I don't care you know it's tea. I care you know it's the Microsoft Access mug.